Good evening. I'm Ann Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures. This year, we are delighted to host architect and urban visionary Jeanne Gang, who will explore the idea of mining the city across 3 Tuesdays. Before we proceed, I want to thank Randy and Melvin Berlin, who are in the audience here tonight on behalf of the Division of the Humanities and the University. Their generosity and vision established the Berlin Family Lectures in 2013, allowing us to showcase the work of individuals who are making fundamental contributions to the arts, humanities, and humanistic social sciences. The lecturers are selected for their unique expertise and their capacity to comment on issues of contemporary importance for the general public, as well as for the Academy. And I am thrilled to announce that in 2019, the Berlin Family Lecturer will be Teju Cole, a renowned author, essayist, art historian, and photographer. I hope you will join us next year for what will undoubtedly be a stimulating series of discussions. Now, the series part of lecture series is crucial to the founding ideals of the Berlin Family Lectures. Each year, these distinguished lecturers join us on campus to offer several talks, culminating in a book published by the University of Chicago Press. By delivering a series of lectures over multiple evenings, they have the opportunity to examine a plurality of topics or approach a single topic from multiple angles. I encourage you all to return next week and the week thereafter so that you can experience all 3 of Jeanne Gang's contributions to the Berlin Family Lectures for 2018. Here to introduce Ms. Gang is my colleague, Christine Meering, Professor of Art History and Department Chair. Fittingly, Christine leads the undergraduate concentration in architectural studies within the Department of Art History, and her scholarship covers a wide range of topics in modern and contemporary art, including the intersection of art and design, as well as public art. Among numerous other publications, she is the author of Blinky Palermo, Abstraction of an Era, and the co-editor of a volume on Gerhard Richter's early work. Many on campus are familiar with Christine's involvement in the Material Matters project, which was responsible for the restoring the sculpture Concrete Traffic by Wolf Vostell, the concrete-encased Cadillac now on display in the 55th Street parking garage. Christine is currently working on an edited volume that details these conservation efforts and on Vostell's use of concrete as a sculptural medium. Please join me in welcoming Christine Meering.
Good evening, everybody. It is a great honor to introduce to you the extraordinary American architect and designer Jeanne Gang. In little over a decade, Jeanne has built an international reputation for advancing and intertwining the social, environmental, and formal possibilities of architecture and design in the 21st century. And as one of merely a handful of successful female architects in the entire history of architecture, she's at the forefront of bringing more diverse perspectives to her profession. Jeanne is the founding principal of Studio Gang, an architecture and urban design practice based here in Chicago, with additional offices on the coasts and major projects in progress across the Americas and Europe, including expansion of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the new US Embassy in Brasilia, and mixed-use towers in Toronto and Amsterdam. Jeanne has been honored with a MacArthur and with a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor, and last year she was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and received a 5th Star Award from the City of Chicago and the Illinois Public Humanities Award. Her work has been exhibited widely, including at MoMA, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and, opening next month, the American Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, co-commissioned by the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute, in an exhibition entitled Dimensions of Citizenship, co-curated by Neil Atkinson, my colleague in the Department of Art History. Venice and the world thus bring me back here to Chicago, for Jeanne's international reputation is profoundly tied to the city, and even, lucky us, to this university. For one, Chicago is the place where Jeanne chose to launch her career after graduating from some other world-class university in Cambridge, Mass, where, too bad for us, she has started teaching. Though I'm pleased to say she has nevertheless helped us in a recent workshop on designing urbanism to imagine a future for urban architecture research and teaching at the University of Chicago. Jeanne's leadership in sustainable architecture and environmental design boasts two major examples in the city: the Lincoln Park Zoo Boardwalk, which you see here, and Northerly Island, which created ecological habitats from a picturesque but unsustainable urban pond and from a man-made peninsula wasteland, respectively. Likewise, Jeanne's path-breaking commitment to a socially engaged design practice that strengthens beneficial relations between individuals and communities responds to local challenges. Say, Police Station, an ongoing project exploring how American police stations can be reimagined through an inclusive design process to better serve their communities. Redesigning public space as an exercise of citizenship and empowerment is also at the core of Studio Gang's contribution to the Venice Biennale, for which hundreds of cobblestones are arriving in Italy from an overlooked but important historic site in Memphis, Tennessee, inspired by the recent removal there of two Confederate statues. Last but not least, Jeanne's formally innovative high-rise facades should be seen in dialogue with a history of international architecture in Chicago that makes this city the greatest museum of modern architecture in the world. The so-called Chicago frame, which in the 19th century brought us the first 10-story and up buildings, freed the facade as an expanse to be designed with few constraints and hierarchies. Studio Gang's signature high-rises, down here in Hyde Park in dialogue with our university's world-class mid-century modernism, as you see here, have seized creative ways not only to animate a plane, but to occupy a facade, to carve out space on the boundary between inside and outside, private and public, individual and social. There's much to be said about the sustainability of these facades too, but let me conclude by saying that this is where, at least for this art historian, Jeanne's work gets most exciting, where new, if subtle, formal and material choices manifest and advance social and environmental causes. In that sense, Jeanne's at the forefront of architecture as a notoriously promiscuous and inherently interdisciplinary discipline, of the kind that we are always eager to hear more from here at the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Jeanne Gang.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Wow, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to be talking about some newer material today, and I'm excited to try it out on you first and foremost. So several years ago, when I was traveling for a project, I came across a ruin. It was a masonry wall made of craggy, irregular, dark gray stones and large white rectangular blocks of petrified coral. The large chunks were punctuated by tiny shards of bright red brick made from a distant clay. Intrigued by this odd combination of materials that seemed incongruous in so many ways, I discovered that the walls were somewhat commonplace on the island I was visiting. Somewhere along the line, I was told that the glue that adhered the materials together, large and small, was described as sweet mortar, and that if you were to lick the walls, it would taste like syrup or molasses. And this, once I got over the image of myself going up to lick the walls, I thought, well, whoever heard of such a thing, sweet walls? Needless to say, my curiosity was fully ignited. Piecing together several sources of geology, history, and agriculture, my team and I discovered the backstory of the walls. The composition is part of the history of the island of St. John, which is today part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Though the walls may look beautiful at first and they might taste sweet, their history, we found out, is quite bitter. The geological stone in the walls is quite innocent enough, having been harvested from one of the 5 geologies of the island. All the rock on St. John was formed from this tumultuous volcanic eruptions that happened way below the level of the water. The coral, the presence of the coral blocks in the wall was a little bit jarring to my eyes, sensitized as they are to the struggles of living coral, which are living animals subject to so many human-induced threats. To make these blocks, the way they did it was they took large pieces that were hacked out of the soft living reef off the coast and then cut them down into dimensional blocks and dried them, and they became the cornerstones of the walls. So if only the Danes had known that this was a living animal and not just a simple underwater plant, they probably wouldn't have done it. But most of these coral are also, the main protection for the islands against hurricanes, but also habitat for millions of organisms. I think it's something like 25% of all ocean life uses the reef as their home. And I don't really like seeing dead animals incorporated into the architecture either, so that was bothersome. But none of this insensitivity, or let's just say ignorance, compares to finding out about the shards of brick that were present in the walls. The brick shards render the most haunting glimpses of the island's past. The brick made in Denmark was likely used as ballast on slave ships. Because human cargo weighed less than ships were designed to carry, they needed extra weight on board. So once the slaves arrived on St. John, the ballast was unloaded and used in the plantation architecture of the island. This is an illustration that there aren't many illustrations of the time, but this one shows a lot of things going on the island, like slaves, the crop of sugar cane that was planted and harvested also by slave labor, and also the walls themselves, which were remnants of cisterns, sugar mills, and homes that were also built by slaves. So all of the materials I guess the question is, are all materials tainted with history, or can they be redeemed in some way? The people that live in the West Indies today are the descendants of those Africans who built the architecture and who hold the connection to the land and the buildings and the monuments. So really, they are the ones that should decide if the ruin should be preserved or not. I've always been sensitive to materials in architecture, seeing the choice of them and the deployment of them on equal footing with the building's function, its form, its technologies. Therefore, the issue of where materials come from, the resources they consume, where they end up, and the way that they make people feel are all central to my thoughts about architecture and the city and the condition, pretty much the condition of living on this planet. So this first talk, it's a series of 3 talks, and the title of the series is Mining the City. But this first talk is really about the material world and its possibilities and limits of reusing physical resources rather than starting from complete scratch. So instead of focusing on extracting materials from these pristine environments, it's interesting to me to see what kind of ideas mining the city can produce. Examining materials and structures we have on hand, including what's considered waste material, might show us a new way forward, and that our existing cities are full of value, memory, and potential. How can we use architecture, considered through the lens of material, to re-envision a response to climate change, and to simultaneously have a response to the waste in a world that's so overflowing with pollution right now? Before digging into the built environment, maybe we can just review how all this material ended up accumulating in our space. This picture, going back to this is from the 1960s. If we look back to this kind of post-war economy that was focused on growth, it becomes clear that there would be a limit to how many items people could possibly fit into their houses and keep buying to fill up their houses. And you see this image, which was an ad for built-in storage from the 1960s. So that built-in storage is a fact that started to expand in order to accommodate more and more things that were being bought. There was at the time a massive increase in disposable consumer goods as another way to expand the economy. The consumer society rose right alongside with the innovations in materials like plastics, the cups that you see there, the concept of planned obsolescence for products, and regulations that required disposable containers for supposedly hygienic purposes. Americans adopted the throwaway society, and the unintended consequences of it were quick to appear. Suddenly all the streets were overflowing with trash, especially in cities like New York that were designed before this explosion of materials. And so at that time, the Keep America Beautiful movement had begun. There was a famous ad for this movement. It's a very popular anti-pollution campaign, but it really wasn't a grassroots movement initiated by citizens of the city. It was actually initiated by the container industry, the prime proponents of the throwaway society. So the intention here, I think it was to put the focus on individual behavior, like us throwing things away and littering, and shifting attention away from the policies that were being discussed in the container industries. In 1970, the first Earth Day, it was only when the citizens group started to form these neighborhood municipal recycling programs to deal with all this extra stuff that was in their lives. Originally, neighbors ran recycling programs themselves with a goal for the city to take over those operations. In 1970, as I said, the first Earth Day, and by 1976, recycling programs were launched at a national level. And that was the time when this slogan that we still use today, which is reduce, reuse, recycle, came into being right around then, so around 1976. And I think that's actually a great word to use to focus on material and architecture, because it has a lot of, it is very potent when it comes to conceptualizing architecture. It's kind of pragmatic, and it's like overused, I guess, in a certain way, but it can be a good place to start. So the three words represent these tactics to address mounting accumulation and pollution on our ever-urbanizing planet. The three R's, as they're known, are simple commands. They're kind of like a call to action. You can see this slogan was written on the German pavilion at the Venice Biennale. It was kind of appropriated by them, even though it's an English American saying. So the slogan tells us to change our habits and think about our personal deeds and how they impact the earth. So the slogan, like, even though it's overused, it's memorable, and it becomes more relevant every day as we have more and more things. I think of ocean plastics and things like that. But no matter its origin, its longevity is either a sign of its enduring power or the complete opposite and testimony to its ineffectiveness to elicit change. So even with new inspiring slogans, like we have now the circular economy, the cradle to cradle, and upcycling as 3 words that are in vogue right now, there's still a need for definitions, I think, around reduce, reuse, recycle, and what they can truly mean for our environment and for our architecture, and how can we scale them up. There's really a lack of precision around these words. Even in the scholarly texts, they tend to be used interchangeably. So I want to use the built environment as a frame that we can that can maybe help us to categorize and sharpen our thinking about this issue in terms of architecture. Each of the 3 terms deserves a working definition. So let's start with the last one first, recycle. This one, in contemporary culture, I think it holds the most privileged position. It's a term that often stands in for other terms, even though they have their own particular meanings. It has, when you think of it in terms of architecture, it has a kind of implied scale to it, or a size. For example, it can be on the scale of large-scale parts and assemblies, such as columns and windows, things that are already made, or it can be about recycled materials for buildings such as blocks and bricks. As far as the lifespan of material goes, recycle is kind of the last resort after you use some kind of pristine, purpose-made material that's already been used in one construction. And it can find a second life by being recycled into another. So looking back a little bit, a story about when I first started thinking about this topic, I had come back to Chicago to start my practice, and I was trying to, I think, kind of like synthesize my earlier diverse architecture experiences, including, going to undergrad and having 1960s era professors that talked about solar energy, and then in graduate school, and then in my European and American working for architects later on. It was a time of these grand projets in Paris. It was a digital revolution in architecture technology. Chicago, though, was an early adopter of sustainability practices, and there was this newly formed Department of Environment, maybe some of you remember, offered by, it was kind of run by Henry Henderson first, and then Bill Abel in the city. And they were offering this international design competition to create the center on the Chicago's far south side called in Calumet. So my office, and we were about 15 people at the time, we decided to enter. And one of the first things we noticed was this interwoven patchwork of wild and wetland natural areas, remnant and abandoned factories in the region, and a legacy of the steel industry. And as our research ramped up, we also learned that Calumet was this important resting place on the migratory bird path called the Mississippi Flyway. And so one of the interns in our office actually was a former biology major, and she had come across an early study that talked about the problems of bird strikes and bird mortality due to collisions with invisible glass and reflective glass in the environment. With this discovery, we kind of had the perfect ingredients for the project. It would be a building that would be, built like a nest, built out of what was available and abundant and nearby, using recycled factory steel and other nearby waste products. For the columns, we thought we could specify steel that was rejected from other job sites and somewhat just available, and somehow figure out a way to accommodate these different sizes and different shapes, like wide flange or tubes, in a design process. And this is very difficult given the design process that we go by to build buildings. There was also newly available online data at the time that was, like allowing technology to help us locate lots of steel that we could use in this project. This is called Steel Spider. It's a website that shows you, hey, there's 7 14 by 48 by 18 wide flange beams available. And so I think there's something very interesting in the idea of being able to marry this like used material with new tools that will help you match them up. Kind of like Match.com for buildings, I guess. Anyway, we worked with an ornithologist on this project, Daniel Clem, to understand the issues surrounding bird strike problems. And then we designed this porch that would protect birds from the impact with glass that they cannot see. We also surveyed, and in this image you can also see the concept of these columns was they would actually go down and become the piles for the foundation as well. We also surveyed a lot of other materials and waste products nearby to incorporate, such as slag and wood from pickle barrels, and we found lots of things that could be used, both passive and advanced environmental systems. Here's some of the materials, that's the test of the slag integrated into the concrete. So we're using a lot of systems, both passive and advanced, to aim at the highest sustainability rating possible. So we won this competition, and it was in 2004. Because it was an example of recycling in a way that could call attention to the physical environment around it, such as the former industry, the watery habitat, and maybe even refer to the lands beyond, like Michigan and Minnesota, where the iron ore came from. When we would experience this building, you would intuitively know that it was part of the place, and it would speak to this important history of Calumet's past, while helping to ensure the future role as a thriving habitat. To do this, to use recycling in this way and make it visible would be a connection to the building and the place. And this project, it was never built, okay, even though we won, but it had such an impact beyond the border of Chicago. It was written about and published widely all over the world, in fact, and so I think it had a major influence. So I want to now talk about a few other projects that use recycling, some contemporary ones by other architects that I think are interesting. This one is a project by S&PS architects. They're young architects in India, and they use salvaged windows and doors, so kind of this middle scale. And what I like is it has a feeling of this kind of informal quality of the settlements in India, even though it probably costs much more, but it has this kind of quality that connects it to its place in how it deploys these materials. Inside, it's actually called the Collage House, and inside it does have a kind of collage-like quality with operable windows and doors that become natural ventilation, and materials that are probably pretty hard to find nowadays, even though they came from demolished buildings. And they like that they're set off with a modern interior. This building is really interesting too. It's a museum. It's called the Ningbo Historic Museum by Wang Shu, who was a Pritzker Prize winner in 2012. And he used in this building like 30 villages, the material that came out of 30 villages demolished in China, and he used it in the walls, and in a kind of very beautiful way. No doubt the people from the 30 villages connect to the new building, but I don't know how they feel. I mean, similar to the Virgin Islands example, this could be equally sad or demoralizing as much as it is poetic. But from an outsider's perspective, it is quite amazing and beautiful. And I wonder if the feelings, the way people relate to these materials is taken into account. This project, there's industrial remnants used. This is a project from an architect I met recently, maybe like last fall, who has been working in Nambia and in South Africa, and her name's Nina Maritz. But she's been integrating these waste into structures like these oil drums. That's what the tiles are there. Curved metal nested to make roof tiles. And the project's called Fontaine Visitor Center. And then you can see that there's a kind of playful use of this in making it like in an uninhibited way, working with local craftspeople also to make the parts of the buildings. The other thing that this architect does is actually accumulate materials. It's almost like a hoarding mentality in order to make recycling possible. In our practice, we have done some scaling down a little bit even further. We've done some recycling. This was a headquarters for the NRDC here in Chicago. And what we used here was a domestic architecture waste. These are moldings that go around doors and windows in houses that were we purchased from the Chicago Building Exchange, and they do the salvaging, and then they were stripped and reassembled. But you can see that we use, in the detail on the right, we maintain the little nail holes in them to give a clue about the origin of the material. At Writers Theater in Chicago, for the interior, you can see these acoustic walls made of brick. That brick actually came from the building that was formerly on the site that was demolished, and really worked with acoustic engineers to mock up and to test how the walls could become this acoustic wall that would make the space more intimate. But there's just a nice connection to the former building. Even though we changed the color of the brick by staining it, we used that material and kept it out of landfill to create this space. And it kind of gives a nice connection to the past. So the scale of all these recycled materials I've been talking about go from, well, you can go from an entire building, but all these materials are bigger than, let's say, dust. And the reason I'm excluding dust right now is, at least for the purpose of this conversation, is that it's not that I'm not interested in dust. I mean, dust is, basically it becomes recycled content, and it has a profound environmental benefit because it can lower the carbon footprint and the embodied energy, and there's like a new thing called secondary raw materials, so there's quite some movement around this idea. But I think when material is pulverized so much, like let's say pulverized slag in concrete, it's not perceptible anymore in the building. So I don't want to put it in the same category as recycle, because right now we're talking about yielding some kind of visual or time connection that it doesn't have. So I think the importance of recycled objects, they are performing in a new location, and it's their ability to tell a story. So if you see the materials such as wood moldings at NRDC or the drums in the Fontaine Visitor Center, you have a connection to this. It's a kind of lost utility of those materials, and so they become categorized as waste. So I think there's a really interesting orientation with respect to time in architecture. When particles of recycling become so small, like recycled content or dust, they lose the connection. There's a book by William Viney who's called Waste, A Philosophy of Things. And he calls this a kind of a waste time that's unique to items that are no longer useful. And just quoting from the book, waste time seems to be able to communicate across the threshold of time, since waste is always waste of something. It is only meaningful if it has a past or a time distinct from its present condition. To discern waste is to both uphold the use that has passed and announce the suspension of utility. So it's quite interesting. There's a whole section in the Academy on waste study these days, and I think there's a strong connection to architecture. As we saw in the Virgin Island fragments, materials can carry history and associations, be they cultural or geological, and they can give both a sense of time, as I described, and they can make us feel something like curiosity or discomfort. They might offer us a sense of continuity with the past or a clear break from it. So recycled materials or assemblies that show up in buildings can be part of a design language, not for nostalgic purposes, but it can be used as potent or enigmatic ways that are clearly visible. If recycling in architecture can be discerned, it suddenly has the ability to convey ideas. It's difficult to talk about recycling without mentioning Rome, where I was spending a little time in the fall, and the issue of spolia spolia comes up a lot. When I was there recently, I went back to look at this Arch of Constantine. It dates from 315 AD, and it has recycled relief carvings on its surface. But just as a pure idea, this arch, it's a kind of a typology that is recycled, and it's very powerful. You see it copied in Paris and other places around the world. But just, mainly focusing on the materials, the power of it, I was thinking more about the different parts and pieces on them. Some of them are coming from earlier monuments, and regardless of their different origins, they make the arch kind of hang together with this as an object with aura. And so I'm not a historian, and it always surprises me how much contempt there is for this arch when you read about it, given the power it has as an object. It's as if the arch is the epitome of non-creativity. So it's notorious for reworking the heads of figures and reliefs to change the identities of them. We're told that this kind of recycling is evidence of a loss of classic skills in carving, and that the recarving was considered despoiling history. But there are newer considerations thanks to work by scholars like Dale Kinney and others that have helped shed a different light on the arch. And that is that it was not a thrown together conglomeration of other monuments. Rather, it was a result of working with what turns out to be a very carefully regulated and officially sanctioned recycling market within the city of Rome at that time. And so the fragments that are present in the arch are recycled elements from buildings that were either being torn down or falling down, and then they were brought up to date to reflect these contemporary persons and subjects. So I think it's pretty creative myself. Another one, just quickly, was this Santa Maria de Cosmedin. It's a church from like 1118, that's the year it was built or finished. And many other Christian churches, and Rome used columns from previous monuments. So in books about spolia, the activity is always portrayed as being either clumsily stumbled upon materials or worse, like thievery. It seems like everyone looks down on this type of recycling. Even like in contemporary literature, like I opened an architectural review magazine from December 2017, so like really recent. And there was a quote in there that said, "Until the Renaissance, most of the inhabitants of Rome were oblivious to its tottering tableau of ruins, blithely appropriating stones from them in new constructions." So I think, and surely, this is more of a practical view of an architect, that spolia has a range of purposes for being used. For example, like if you were building a defense wall, you might use anything that's lying around fast to get the defense up. But there's a spectrum of ways that it's been mined out of the past buildings. It's not all just plundered loot. There is, I can vouch for this, there's a high degree of technical difficulty with reusing materials. You got to measure them, select them, repurpose them, and you can see in this image that these columns are all different, and they're not even the same size. And so the architect has to decide, should I line them up at the top or line them up at the bottom? Know what they're capable of carrying structurally. And you can see here that the choice was made to line them up at the top. And then if you look at the bases, you can see how those different bases were accommodated to make up the dimensional difference. So there's clearly creative force behind making these work and making this nave. So, and then some other places we even saw that in Rome that there's very special pieces that were from pagan times that are used in very prominent places. So I think there's probably a whole interesting take on spolia that could be made. So moving on to the idea of reuse, it's the largest, to me, it's the largest scale, the most obvious, the most debated of all the three R's, in fact, because of the word use in there. Reuse connects strongly to the program of a building or function. So reuse implies the idea that the entire building is going to be repurposed from a former use to a new one. In a way, this concept is so prevalent throughout history that it seems almost too normal to talk about it, yet there are still super unresolved conflicts with reuse that tend to linger. First, there's this friction between historic preservation and adaptive reuse. Historic preservation recommends finding an appropriate use that's in keeping with the original, preserving as close as possible the actual elements of the earlier structure. The second one, adaptive reuse, suggests that continued use is the best way to preserve culture, and that so you can alter it really to any degree necessary in order to accommodate a new function. So this debate, you can go back and trace the original debate to these conflicting attitudes when conservation practice was being written about and theorized. So you have John Ruskin on the left. He's known for his critique on art and architecture and taste, and advocates for preservation of as is, and he loves ruins. He draws all kinds of ruins. He's very anti-restoration at the time they used that word. In Seven Lamps, he proclaims that the buildings he appreciated the most were for their age, the age value, more than any of the materials or other qualities that they have. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Viollet-le-Duc, Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, whose motivations to preserve heritage in France were through saving these important monuments, many of them that were going to fall down or had been neglected. And he uses this really interesting philosophy where he's trying to imagine that he's the original architect and what he would have done to the building to repair the flaws and to make changes. And so you can see that the image on the right it's pretty creative, and this work was hated by Ruskin, but it presents a whole different kind of attitude. So there was an exhibit at one of the biennales in 2010 that was by OMA and Rem Koolhaas, who talked about chaos, which was a name that doesn't exist for anything, but it was about the struggle between preservation and restoration that is ongoing. And he accuses the preservation movement of striving to preserve larger and larger territories while simultaneously abandoning the preservation of post-war architecture, and especially social architecture like housing projects. So he sees this hypocrisy reflected in the present day. He said, preservation and modernity are not opposites. Preservation was invented as part of a groundswell of modern innovation between the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution in England. In a maelstrom of change, it's crucial to decide what will stay the same. So in reality, I think the preservation and restoration attitudes have evolved since Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc, and there's new understandings about these things, in addition to new parameters like sustainability and new conflicts that have come up. There's very pragmatic reasons for trying to reuse older structures. You see on the left the Stony Island Savings Bank, which was converted to the art space of Theatre Gates. I think that building was maybe 1929. And on the right is our building, Studio Gang's building, the Polish National Alliance, which was 1934, which is now converted to an architect's and makerspace. So the two structures show that historic buildings can add heritage to a neighborhood without being tied so literally to the originals in every way. I think in both cases, the conversions of the structures were pretty extreme on the inside, even though the outside are preserved. But because they're both banks, I like to think that it's just looks at like how valuable art and architecture are to be in banks. So I want to just tell a little bit about the Prentice Hospital, that some buildings that the public loves to hate don't make it to the finish line for preservation. One of these, it deserved more consideration, I think, for adaptive reuse, in my opinion. It was the Prentice Women's Hospital designed by Bertrand Goldberg, and it was really interesting from a structural point of view. One day I pointed out to a visiting critic from the New York Times, Michael Kimmelman, that the building was going to be demolished, and he asked me, what would you do to try to save its life? And then he said if I would think about that and propose something, he would publish it, and then maybe that would give it another chance as a landmark. This interesting thing about the building is it does not have a central elevator core. So it has a column there, but the middle is quite open. So we came up with what I call the stack solution, which was based on, there's an programming app that's about stacking these things. And the idea that really the formal language of this building already suggested what should go, that something else should go on top of it. You can see the podium, we kept the same. The lobed building, the 4 petals, we kept the same. And then we kind of skewered it with a core that was structurally sound. We even worked with an engineer, Magnus and Klemenczyk, to figure this out. And then put all of the program that they wanted in this building above it. And so interesting that the basic strategy was already there in the initial building. And so by adding this core, we were able to give them everything that they would possibly desired. It was primarily like a thought exercise, but it was done out of genuine care for the building and the idea that preservation and reuse could offer something unique here. And it wasn't historic preservationists that said no, it was really the client, that wasn't really our client anyway, but, and then never again probably. And but I think there was like just a lack of understanding about how exciting this could really be. And, and we're not the first ones to think of that. Well, there's this building shows there's a contradiction between what Northwestern wanted, which was a brand new building, and then this kind of age value that I mentioned before. So at Prentice, we could basically get both, the new bling and the old, so I thought it was cool. But there are some other examples out there right now. This is Herzog Demeron's Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which is built on top of a storage building, and it's a totally new use, a totally different architecture and interesting contrast. And then on the right is Zaha Hadid Architects, the Antwerp Port House, which really takes a different approach to the original for sure. We're currently working on this project, which is this is the coolest contrast I think. It's a former coal-fired power plant, okay, and we are turning it into, believe it or not, a health, wellness, and recreation center for Beloit College. So I love the contrasting use with that, and it's amazing. But the sustainability approach, this is the interesting thing here. We ran up against this conflict between the historic building and the sustainability approach. So in a very direct way. So in order to save energy on this building, which has no insulation in it, we would suggest the best way to do it is put the insulation on the outside and reclad the entire building. So here you can see our first version, which was insulated, adjusted to the use, and clad in a Corten steel around the building. But to achieve the historic building credits, which are the instruments, the financial instruments that you need, we were asked to put the insulation on the inside, keep some of the old leaky windows, and not have the roof terrace visible from any of the vantage points of the building. So, I mean, because we want this building to happen, we actually took that on. And I also say that, up in the corner on the left, it's redesign is kind of where we were going, and the way this ended up going was more like addition, not on top, but on the side. So it's still a beautiful project, but it does point to this kind of very difficult problems between sustainability and historic preservation. It still looks pretty nice, though. This is the addition of the big open space, which will be a place for lacrosse and other sports inside there. Another really cool project by Thomas Heatherwick that just recently opened is using subtraction on one of these industrial buildings. So it turned from a grain silo to an art museum, and you can see how the building has been carved away to make a dynamic space in the middle. Italians have been dealing with reuse for so long, many of their structures. They invented a lot of ways to distinguish between the old and the new. So another approach to adaptive reuse is to make it clear what's old and what's new. This goes back to theories by a guy called Camillo Boato in the 19th century who outlined the approach. But it's not surprising to see this. This is one of the most exciting buildings, I think, as an adaptive reuse that I saw it as a student, and I've gone back to it several times. This master of reuse, old and new, is Carlo Scarpa, who is an Italian architect that was working. He did this design for Castelvecchio, which is kind of the standard, I guess you would say. So what I'm going to show you is in the knuckle there, where it's dark black. That is one of the most complex spaces that I've ever seen. It is a place that holds this sculpture called the grande, the second. And so there's so much interesting design thought that went into how to display this sculpture, how to highlight it from the old and the new, and how to move people around it from every vantage point, that it's so utterly contemporary or modern in its sensibility. Here you can see it you can see the sculpture is kind of right in the middle of the slide, and this bridge going across using steel. And other times you come right up against the sculpture. It's always clear what is new. You can look at the stair in the background. It's a steel stair that's hanging down between a crack, suspended, and it's just a fantastic project if you ever get a chance to go to Verona. Finally, reduce is the last one of the 3 R's, and I think it gets the least attention. And it's obvious that reduce would have the biggest impact on waste and reducing the amount of stuff we have. And before we were looking at that kitchen with all the kitchen cabinets in it to store things. Today we have entire buildings to store things. It doesn't seem like we're going in the right direction. Just as architecture, this makes space on our planet. So some architects are concerned with doing these projects. I guess, when you think of reduce, it might seem antithetical to the creative spirit and making, it's almost like it cancels out the idea. Reduce could be interpreted as don't build. That would be very bad for me, for sure. But I think it's really reduced that holds the most, probably the most potential to make a big impact. So I want to try to think about it in different ways. I mean, the first thing you think of is Mies van der Rohe, right? I mean, he's the one that said less is more. But really, with his work, and I guess you could call it minimalism, it's not really about reducing, really. I mean, it is about making things more simple looking. But we all know that making things simple is not easy, and it takes a lot of materials. So this is a beautiful project by Sana. It's called the Louvre Lens Museum, and it is extraordinary. But it also, in order to do this aesthetic strategy, to simplify the elements, you have to have, make giant pieces of glass, and you have to have whole new machines that are able to do the brushed aluminum. And I mean, it is an incredible thing to do, but I don't think it has to do with reduce. And so minimalism really is, really only achievable for the wealthy. And so, and there was Buckminster Fuller also, he changed the saying less is more to doing more with less. And I thought that was, and it's an engineer's goal, but for the purpose of this discussion, it's a good way to think about it. So the closest thing you can think of, I guess, there's a couple parts. One is there's this tiny house movement. I don't know if you've heard about it, but there are so many people trying to do the tiny house. I want more architects, more design architects to try it. A lot of people are, doing it themselves, and it's very interesting phenomena. To just live in under 500 square feet. It's probably why you get those storage buildings, actually. I just thought of that. Okay, but so then there's micro apartments, which are really, this is N Architects, which are, they built the first one in Brooklyn, which are very small apartments, very, very nice, but a response to a crushing need for housing pretty much in most major cities. And this is really, they're happening everywhere. We're doing one as well in Denver. And so there's a lot of innovation around how to make a small apartment really accommodating. Then there is the co-living movement, which is represented here, which is actually a tall building by PLP Architects in London. And this is really has to do with the idea that millennials don't want to buy homes anymore, and they think of living more as a service. So there's new businesses popping up, like one called The Collective, and if you know WeWork, there's now going to be We Live. And the founder of The Collective once said, I think he said, we will all be homeless someday. And I think that's the goal. It's like we can move into these different environments and share parts of the building, and therefore you're reducing the footprint, reducing the amount for every single person, but also getting a social environment at the same time. So finally, I just show a project that we did, which was along these lines, which was a project for Cicero, Illinois, the suburb of Chicago, and it was shown at the Museum of Modern Art. And this project really was taking a look at what we could do given the foreclosure crisis. So this was in 2010, and we decided to look at a suburban environment and see, how to wondering if the foreclosure crisis could provide some opportunity to rethink the way that we live and work. And there we discovered in Cicero that, it's a city of new arrivals of immigrants, really. And in the early days, it was coming from these 3 countries in Europe, and now really coming from 3 states in Mexico. But the same idea, only the difference is now there are no big factories. This factory once had 40,000 workers working there. And that just doesn't exist anymore. So people are doing different things. There were a lot of homes foreclosed upon, and not just because people, took borrowed too much money. It was really because they lost their jobs. And so this is a kind of plagued area with both no jobs, some environmental pollution, and really a lot of foreclosure. So we looked at the main building stock that was there, which were these small bungalows, which were for the, this typical family in the 20th century. And what was happening was more people were moving into those. So they were already cohabitating in the bungalow and retrofitting them to meet their needs. And it's like this extended version of a family, maybe it's relatives coming from your home state, maybe it's single, unrelated adults living together to share space and save money. So it's kind of a totally different phenomena. So we said, what if we could take these different uses and instead of being confined in the bungalow envelope, reshuffle them and reassemble them to better match these contemporary families and living spaces. So our model we came up with is, what if we had a building that you could grow and expand? You could have as minimal amount of bedrooms that you needed, and you could share other places like the kitchens and dining with other people, and in utilizing this abandoned factory network. So kind of reusing these buildings, reinventing them, and we showed a way, we took one example of a factory and tried to show how the units could be in there. So these units, you would own your own unit, but not the land that it would sit on, so you still have this invested equity. So there was a whole complete concept of how to do this from an economic standpoint. And it would just it would be this higher density growing out of the infrastructure of the factory. And so instead of being divided into a neighborhood that has residential here, factories there, and recreation there, you would get this completely combined fabric, which you see at the upper part of the slide, of the reinvented factories, live-work space, an economy that would accommodate materials and uses, and tied into the existing network of alleys, which is where a lot of the cool stuff was happening there. So just to wrap up this first material world talk, I think we could point to a couple of challenges to summarize the arguments that I was starting to make today. One is that, recycling is not like a totally perfect solution to everything. There's always going to be the question about this harvesting of the materials. Where did they come from? What happens to the site where the materials are taken from? And today there's also this question of toxicity of the materials and, are they safe? It's a lengthy process. And then there's barriers to this from both the society, and there's economic barriers. For example, it takes more work to prepare these materials for recycling. So labor, in our current system, because we pay tax on labor and not on resource use, it penalizes or it disadvantages this idea of using more work to prepare the materials for recycling. So I think in order for recycling to, and recycling itself to take hold, we'd have to overcome those barriers with policy. We also need policy, though, to turn around this, I would say it's a twisted logic that makes reduce, reuse, recycle only an individual choice. Like, why do I always feel guilty about whether I'm recycling? And it's not just an individual choice. There needs to be policy that incentivizes each of these three terms. For a simple example, I was in Ireland, and we had to pay there for every bag and the weight of the trash that we threw away. So the result of that, product and food producers responded to this by making less packaging and making their items more desirable. And so people bought items, they literally bought items that had less packaging and less waste. So it's just an example of how policy can help. And the second thing I think is the challenge of preservation, which we were talking about. Where is it going? When does it start to prevent this in creative interpretation, and how is an architect supposed to deal with sustainability demands that are at odds with preservation ideas? What is worth saving? Who gets to decide what's worth saving? So those are all things that are kind of thorny. And today, we talked about recycling, how it plays with this idea of waste time. So these are the kind of the opportunities that it has, how it gives meaningful connections to the world that entirely new things don't have. Recycling offers a way to start with what's there, to embed an aspect of time into our constructions and to add to their relevance. And so it's kind of like reintegrating the past into the future in a wide variety of ways that are both interesting and creative. So in that sense, mining the city is a new way of thinking about our resources. When does the material hold this meaning? When does it stop holding this meaning from the past? How can we harness technology like the ones I told you about, Steel Spider and Match.com? How can we harness these things to help us with better recycling? So we also talked about reuse, new uses in old structures to help preserve them, probably more so than any other adaptation. Like if you think of the Pantheon, for example, look how long that's been in use. And they say that really the conversion of the Pantheon from a pagan temple to a Christian temple is actually what saved it. So buildings with additions like Zaha Hadid's building, we saw on top of the cold storage building with Herzog Demeron, these are bringing a new life to an out-of-date structure that might otherwise be torn down, but they also add this kind of newness value. And finally, we talked about reduce, like strategies of sharing, making buildings smaller, and mixing their uses. So today we began, I think this talk is the first, for me, trying to expand this intellectual framework for creativity in the material world that works, that we reviewed should no longer be banished into this segregated category in architecture, which is what they do today. Like there's only a separate category for all buildings that are reused. They should be central to the field. So with that, next week, I'm going to talk about a larger scale, mining the city, landscapes, infrastructures, occupations. We're going to look at vacant buildings, vacant cities, and shift our conceptions of what these places can be and the opportunities they have. So it might seem weird to you, for me, like an architect, you showed a lot of my new buildings for the introduction, to think about old buildings and materials and forlorn landscapes in this time that we're in, which is really defined by virtual things. There's an exuberance for newness right now and a dizzying, unprecedented speed of production. But maybe the idea of recapturing, reinterpreting, and re-engaging with what's already here can stimulate a different kind of creativity. Maybe it could spur a deeper understanding of the past and set up more enduring relationships for the future at the same time. And maybe the ideas will spill out of these materials and spaces if we can just adjust our perception of them or simply adjust our concept of what we consider to be waste. Thank you very much.